Hello and welcome to another episode of the C Vision International Thought Leadership Podcast Series. Today, we're very happy to welcome, all the way from London, England, Mr. Jason Parke. Jason is a senior IT leadership professional specializing in higher education and currently serving on staff at the University of Greenwich. Jason's been working in the technology industry for over 20 years, and he's here to share his unique perspective on information technology trends affecting the education community and information security concerns high on the agenda for the industry. Jason, welcome.
Hi, Igor. How you doing?
Perfect. Well, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us. So I understand you have a particular expertise in the education community in UK, and we'd love to hear about some of the trends affecting the industry. You know, we understand there is a lot of movement in the education community, trying to embrace new technologies, emerging technologies, things like virtual reality, augmented reality, machine learning, artificial intelligence, big trends like that are certainly affecting the learning modes that are being applied to the communities. I'm curious what you're seeing in London, what you're seeing in UK, how things might be different from what we're seeing here in the US. And of course, the big question, what has COVID done to the education community in the last year and a half?
Thank you, Igor. Yes, yeah. COVID particularly has introduced a topic which I guess we over here are kind of coining digital poverty. And what does that mean? That might mean for a particular student, they don't have a laptop, or the broadband at home is a kind of slow speed, and it's the complete spectrum of anything and everything in between. So I guess to kind of sum it up, how do you sum up the last 18 months, potentially 2 years in one quick sentence as far as COVID? And it probably, to start that journey, it probably needs me to kind of go back to what the team were doing as we were preparing that kind of March date that's familiar with everyone, taking an institute that was predominantly in person, in classroom, and then shifting that space to an online environment. And I guess as we walked into that, we started talking particular technologies. I don't want to get into the Microsoft Teams and Zoom and et cetera, but we were predominantly pioneering, the team and I were kind of pioneering, saying that we're leading some of these technologies. They've all become common practice now, and the education environment now is looking at what do we do moving this forward as we push into what would be classed as September, the academic year. How do we use this hybrid environment now, which is very much a blend of in-person and online. So what did COVID mean for the IT teams? A shift from the physical, just like everyone else, into the environment we're in on at the moment. But one of the immediate positives that has come out of something like that is what was previously physically, geographically limiting. We've now got a kind of, I don't want to say a global, because let's keep it UK based and almost London based. We're now faced with quite a lot of opportunity and quite a lot of change as well. Still, as we come out of that.
That's very insightful. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. So, where are you seeing some of the new technologies being applied to this new model, this hybrid model, right? We're seeing a lot of remote learners, and of course, the learning community has become more globalized. And we're certainly seeing some of the commercial offerings out there, things like Masterclass and similar platforms, Udemy, sort of pushing into the traditional education space and maybe grabbing some of the mind share from the traditional educational institutions. So were you seeing an impact from that? Do you see more of a demand from your learners to deliver those same kinds of capabilities where you can provide more of a hybrid learning mode or enhance the use of these technologies that kind of bring the people in and make them stay?
Yeah. So fortunate, there was an event at the beginning of this year, January, augmented reality, virtual reality, where we scratched on, I guess, how institutes, I won't mention names just yet in terms of where we're promoting them, but how the education sector were using the headsets in the taught class environment, and how this is almost changing the field. So one, the medical profession, and I guess the way in which doctors and practitioners would be using the headsets now to deal with patients, and obviously teams. And this plays into COVID, COVID where the distancing and the proximity. So previously you'd have the doctors walk around the patient's bed and do their walk arounds, and you might have a team of 8. Whereas now, and again, geographically, that team need not be located even on the same hospital. So one can have a headset, and a lot quicker on the diagnosis in terms of the tools and information that's available to the experts, and in terms of spotting and making diagnosis. So that was on the medical side of things. On the game side of things, predominantly and typically students wearing the headsets and creating games and using that. There's a massive demand and a massive drive, and as the prices come down for these devices, they're quite high end and ever so slightly out of reach at the moment, but as they come down and then they become a little bit more common place, it just changes that kind of tipping point where it then can speed up the technology and the iteration of how we can actually get these devices into the homes. And I mentioned that in terms of digital poverty, we might have on one instance a student without a laptop. So cost, so this is a slightly higher end where a headset of that caliber, but it kind of leads into things like open days. And what we would class for or a typical open day, where we'd have the masses come in. Previously, I'm kind of maybe missing that in-person environment where you'd meet with parents or meet with potential students and just either give them a walk around as to this being the organization, the institute, the university that you come in to study. So one technology that were being investigated was to have the open day in a kind of, obviously in a virtual room, but then with the headset to kind of guide that tour around in the virtual environment. So it's not quite there yet when, if I'm coming to a university and I just want to go listen to the speaker, find out the information, maybe jump to a room, presenting that in a kind of virtual environment is new, and the challenge that the organizations have to take it to the next stage and say, here you go, put on this headset. The headsets are not in everyone's house yet, so we're not quite there yet. But the good thing is the technology, and getting a little sneaky peek behind the scenes, the technology is being driven and being promoted and being developed in that area. Yeah.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, I mean, you talk about digital poverty, and I think we've seen some of that exposed. And of course, the U.S., we're very technologically advanced, and we've got a lot of, the penetration of broadband is very deep. Although we still have a lot of pockets where that's not a reality. And of course, folks like Elon Musk are talking about that with things like Skylink, getting higher bandwidth to some of these rural remote areas. But those are becoming fewer and far between, right? Yeah, for most part, the broadband is there, especially in concentrated urban areas. It's pretty much taken for granted. I mean, we do have some areas that are still DSL. Yeah, but by and large, you can get higher speeds. And, for things like Zoom, for instance, 1.5 megabits per second up and down gets you full HD quality, which is great. So we see a lot of that adoption happen, and folks are embracing these technologies more and more, but we still have to be mindful of the fact that, taking that for granted, it's not really good, right? Because some folks just don't have that capability. And how do we reach out? How do we extend the blanket of coverage for everyone so that we can have kind of a more inclusive learning environment that's open to everyone, and even prospective learners, right? I think just make it more attractive. That's a challenge.
we tend to only be as fast as our slowest links. So, even if you're going to take 98% of the masses over and say 5G and say, wow, come on over, you still have to stop and look back and say, well, hold on a minute. We've got one household or one individual that just isn't quite ready for that yet. And how do we make those provisions for that individual? And it might even be a community to make sure that, we're there. And inclusivity, and without going way off on a tangent, just making sure that there's a slightly more leveled playing field, so that the gap is not so broad a gap.
Sure. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, nothing's without its caveats. So, of course, we've seen this huge adoption, and we're talking about big things like, the adoption of cloud technologies, and how many enterprises kind of rushed headlong into it when they were forced into it. And we've seen some industry experts talk about the fact that we probably have accelerated our adoption timeline by maybe 5 years, maybe 6, maybe more. Maybe it wouldn't even be here by 2025, but COVID made it happen and kind of forced everyone's hand. So a lot of folks jumped into the cloud without maybe necessarily being ready for it. And, you have to continue to operate, and you have to adopt and adapt. And they did, a lot of us did, but now we're sort of finding ourselves in this different risk posture that we may not have planned for. And of course, you're seeing a lot of breaches, you're seeing a lot of compromises. A lot of data is leaking. Just yesterday we heard about Electronic Arts, which is a gaming company in the US. Big leak, 780 gigabytes of data. We're talking about source code. We're talking about multiplayer features within their game set. Big issue. And turns out all it took was a $10 purchase on the dark web. That's all it took. So we're seeing these giant companies that ostensibly invest a lot of money into security and infrastructure fall prey to these fairly basic attacks. And what do they boil down to? Social engineering. Somebody got tricked. And so it's becoming even harder when you have not just the distributed nature of your operations, but also this extended community of folks who do connect to you. And so I'm very curious within the education space, coming from environments like Microsoft, where we used to run like a campus. We would say we are running like a campus. Everything's allowed unless it's patently malicious, right? We would allow that collaboration, we would encourage innovation, we would encourage agility, information sharing, maintain controls, but allow that collaboration to flourish. There are challenges with that. But in a true campus environment that a university represents, there are really very few controls. And that's sort of by design. You want to encourage people to learn and explore and connect. Obviously, COVID has made that even more difficult. So I'm curious what you're seeing within the education space in the UK. How is this affecting both your learners and the educators, the infrastructure of these universities? How are they coping with it? And what are some of the challenges that they're seeing right now?
Yeah, it's a very interesting space to be observing and to be a part of. I'm fortunate. One of my many hats, one of my roles. I'm vice chair of a London group, UCISA, and what that group is, it's a group of digital practitioners, professionals. So the higher education, the further education, from a London group perspective, it's basically the institutes that you would know of in central London and surrounding. And what the group have done, they've put on events and gathered the institutes together. And I guess last month we were quite fortunate to hear one of the universities that had been hit by malware. And you can imagine, for anyone who's been through this experience to come forward and talk, it's very sensitive. And you kind of in a game where you want to actually be saying you're a leader, to actually show that degree of vulnerability and exposure. So I won't mention probably the institute's name, but I'll hopefully maybe go in on the slightly granular detail and share in terms of what we were seeing and how the community kind of pulled together and helped those guys out. So for from last month and since COVID, we we'd seen probably 9 institutes. And this, when I say an institute, I'm referring to either a university or an FE, a full-time education college, having been hit since we went into lockdown. So, and that's when I say being hit, I'm talking about completely taken offline. And in this particular instance, last month's talk, we were talking about, so the malware had come in, and it was completely shutting down the end user's device. Could be PC, could be server. So the IT team in that particular instance, they were overwhelmed. And they were just, as you would do, they were just trying to deal with the event as it was materializing. So what the community, UCISA, the body, were able to do, they offered that kind of helping hand, that where they reached out and said, look, we've got technicians, we've got teams that can offer you a helping hand. Let's get you up out of this. And I guess those guys were so fortunate that they were. And it wasn't just the one hit. They actually, in total, they experienced. It was by the third time. I think Microsoft got involved on about the second hit, and started from a preventative point of view, started blocking even at the highest level, so that the attack from an internal point of view were not so damaging, but. You're talking fatigue, you're talking, you're talking well-being, you're talking, it's when you start an exercise like that, how do you kind of quantify? You can easily say, oh, it's impacted all of the servers or all of the stations within an organization. But how do you then quantify the general fatigue that the team are feeling, and helping the guys at that level when they're obviously going through something like that? Yeah. So the community, very paranoid, very, one from an outside as perspective, looking at the organization that's been hit, saying, we hope that doesn't happen to us. It's not necessarily that kind of us and them approach so much. It's more a case of response, and how can we quickly respond to this. Yeah,
it's definitely an issue. I mean, trying to burst up your capability, your capacity during an incident like that, it's very difficult. That's why folks reach out to outside consultants, of course, and bring on big firms like Mandiant and folks like that. So that's not uncommon. We definitely saw that with Colonial Pipeline and many other incidents where your first call is to these folks, and sometimes you just keep them on retainer permanently, just so you can have that ability to instantly burst up your team to double it, triple it, or et cetera. I mean, we saw that when Saudi Aramco got hit years ago with, I think, one of the first instances of ransomware, and basically bricked tens of thousands of systems, and they basically had to rebuild their entire IT infrastructure. Everybody who had any connection to them was deployed. Yeah. And, they wound up with thousands of hands helping out, because that's the effort that you need. It's very difficult in an educational setting to just immediately avail yourself of this kind of capability. And that's a challenge. I can definitely understand the paranoia. It's not unwarranted. And of course, leaning on your community, that's big, right? Being able to rely on folks within your industry who have similar problems. It's nice to collaborate across different verticals, but sometimes your problems are uniquely yours. Yes. And that's no truer than in a very unique setting like educational. So I'm curious, what do you see some of the trends that are affecting your ability to deal with these kinds of attacks and these sort of these risks and these threat environments that you're operating in? How has it changed? Do you see maybe getting more resources because of the currently elevated threat and risk climate? Do you think this will continue? And to what degree do you think that also affects your ability to kind of do the business of education? And I'm not talking about just the learning environment itself, but also I'm mindful of things like the research work that large universities do, especially when they have medical schools attached. There's a lot of their proprietary information there, and some of the bleeding edge research that might be compromised, not just from a perspective of information leaking, but also the actual research process being compromised and shut down. What do you think, some of the investments need to happen, and where do you see some of the challenges there?
Yeah. So investments are a big driver. So small little change, MFA, things like taking all the students' emails over to that type of method of access is one thing that creates a very slow change on the end user's front. Yeah, even just to roll something like that organization wide is a very slow iteration, and by the time you get to the end of that process, you're almost looking at the second iteration and repeat, and technology, as you know, is moving at such a fast pace to even roll those kind of changes out. And I know that the word telemetry and convergence are very topical when you're doing it across several different site zones, regional. But if typically the education environment, it was quite slow to change, quite, and that example where I mentioned of community, where you've got one organization helping out another, was not so common. You'd have things like league tables, you'd have things like individual institutes competing. So it's only until previously you'd get into a conference and professionals are sharing best practices that you'd actually see that information exchange previously. So what you've got now, and what I'm seeing more so, is that kind of exchange of ideas and that rapid iteration, not just within a local team or in a local organization, but more so across the different institutes. And it plays into how quickly we as organizations can make that change at the highest level. Because naturally, when the senior leaders are getting that information and getting that content, it does filter down when it's coming at the kind of correct level. That kind of culture and cultural change, it kind of just works its way down through the cracks. But a big driver is the budgets. A big driver is the funding. So it's not necessarily just having the correct info, the correct technology, and a good solid institute that everyone can be that kind of go-to, or even choice. The end user wants a little bit of choice between making a decision like that. But the governments were tested as we went into COVID. The UK government and also, I know we scratched on things like the topic of digital poverty, but how do you actually make that resource available so that it's filtering down across the institutes is the challenge that I guess from a UK perspective, we in the UK are seeing, experiencing, and making sure that that's just rippling down. So yeah.
So I'm curious, what do you see? You mentioned government involvement and private-public cooperation and collaboration is something we talk about in the U.S. frequently, especially in the key of the recent cyber attacks and the role that the government should play in kind of helping protect the critical national infrastructure. Education today is not considered to be critical national infrastructure, although I would argue against that classification. I think that's probably one of the more important things. But folks think about things like water dams and supply systems and chain systems, and supply chain systems and fuel, like the Colonial Pipeline. But education is important, and we've seen the huge impact from a kind of personal perspective, so social perspective, where we have kids at home for the last year plus, and they're getting stir crazy, and the parents are getting crazy, and they're not getting the right kind of education, not getting the right kind of engagement. Zoom is fine, but that personal connection is just not there, and it hasn't been there. And there are some conversations about how it might have affected the mental state of kids. Maybe we have a whole generation of kids right now who will never be the same based on that impact. And so from that perspective, if you think about that level of impact, education plays a huge role, and not just from the learning perspective, but also giving this community feeling to this generation of kids. And so when education is impacted, society is impacted. So to me, it is part of the critical infrastructure. So I think my personal opinion is that, I think the government has a role to play here, and the private-public engagement has to be. And I'm curious, where do you see that in UK? How much role does the government play in helping secure national infrastructure, and specifically within the educational space? Do you see involvement by GCHQ, MI5, other agencies of the UK government? Do you rely on that for help, and should it be better in the future?
The COVID model, where funds were released, was more of an emergency pot. The typical model is a much slower moving pot, and sometimes it's much slower. It's so the movement that I saw as we went into lockdown, and it could be something as simple as making sure everyone was home ready. I mean, laptops. Not every user before we started that exercise had a laptop in their house, and likewise the kids studying. So for the government, the UK government really aided, had these COVID pots to just kind of get this, but it was slow. It was very slow, to obviously release and to kind of get this rolled out. It was very slow, and as I said, it's still iteratively kind of rolling itself out. Where even now we're still making provision to get. I'll say something as simple as laptops to the end user, but that's getting kind of granular, and you need to apply it on a slightly more grander scale to see. But it gets the point across. It's a good example.
So what are the big things on the agenda for the education community right now that you see coming up on the horizon? What do you see maybe the next 18 to 24 months bringing in terms of infrastructure spending, cybersecurity attention? Where do you see some of the trends, and what should be done about the emerging risk posture that we're seeing across the world, but specifically targeting the education community in the UK?
Yeah. No, it's a fantastic question. We're making provisions for the taught classroom. Previously was an environment where the academic the lecturer was on a pedestal. They'd be at the front of the class teaching and delivering to the individual students. Now, how do you make that environment? The question was posed: how do you make that environment where you've got some of your learners at home, some of your learners in the classroom, and you then take and make that kind of blended classroom experience, so that individual who's at home is getting the same experience that individual who's in the classroom is getting. And it may simply be that the teacher's saying to the class, all right, have a conversation with the person next to you, and then feedback into the class. So the stats and the data is too early to say, but we've got a year's worth of data already, a COVID year's worth of data where that peer relationship, where someone who was in the classroom versus someone who's online, is being compared. There's a really interesting project, a European-based project, and it plays into some of the augmented reality, the virtual reality space, where this particular project's being piloted in Greenwich at Greenwich University, and they're running simultaneously a classroom where the academic is delivering to two separate classes, and the purpose and the exercise and the activity is to just compare and contrast whether someone wearing a headset, the same material, what the learning experience is, versus someone who's obviously going through the exercises in person. And there's areas of health and safety. It's like a work shop where you'd have all the necessary training that would apply in an engineering environment, on those type of disciplines, where at the end of the exercise, at the end of the class, those who went through it in person, as you would experience and expect, they get a typical grade for how well they've performed. To take that over to the slightly contrasted environment for those individuals, and I'm not just talking sitting down watching a YouTube video with a headset on. It's a little bit more engaging, where the individuals would be trained on the curriculum, but trained where previously it would be very, very practical. So just a kind of comparison between the online environment. This is a European funded project, and again, we've had a year, not necessarily to do it so well, but obviously as we move forward, I'll be really keen to see as we push over the summer how the material materializes and we get into September, the latter part of this year, where the actual students get access to this. And it's almost a case of, here you go, guys, here you go, area A and area B, get on with it kind of thing, and let's see the results. So some areas are new, unfolding. Some areas are being developed. Some areas within the space are. It's going to be a case as we move forward, as we push forward, what we actually see and how we as organisers, we as institutes, just take that data, capture those results, and respond to them accordingly. Because I mean, from a personal perspective, my two children, they responded very differently to the COVID environment. From an academic perspective, one preferred the classroom environment. The other didn't mind so much the online environment, and it could play into not necessarily so much study, but the social and the gaming, even the gaming environment, very different to me growing up. I might have gone out on and from a bicycle perspective, my childhood was very much an outdoor, whereas my kids, their play environment is very much an online. So, slightly different, but what does that mean in terms of how we use that, embrace that, move forward with that? And what does that mean for the iterations of the students coming in? We could probably cover a whole topic on well-being. We could probably cover a whole topic on that kind of mind space. We could probably cover a topic on some of the learners that have I don't want to mention anything so specific, but if individuals and individual learners have particular disabilities, how do we then cater and provide provisions for those individuals, such that again that gap is just not so broad.
Challenges definitely abound, and we live in a brave new world now, the post-COVID world, hopefully soon post-COVID.
Yes.
And things can maybe go back to normal, but hopefully not too normal, because look, we've made some progress, and some of that progress may have been forced, but here we are, and we live in a different place now. A lot of hybrid models. Some folks want to go back to the office, some folks don't. We're seeing some statistics being collected that I think almost 45%, at least in the US, said they will not be going back to the office if they're mandated to. They would rather quit their jobs than go back to the office. So we have data points like that. So I think people are adapting this new lifestyle, and they're enjoying it. They're having more time with the family. Some people are not. Some people want to go back to the office. They want the break from the family. It depends. But I think it's not one or the other. It will be a hybrid model. It certainly applies to the education community. People want to learn differently, just like your two kids, they have different styles, they have different approaches, and that's fine. And I think the challenge for us will continue to be to make those work styles and learning styles available and make them equal and make them equally accessible for all kinds of communities of learners. So that's a challenge, and they'll definitely keep us busy for the foreseeable future. So thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate you sharing all your insights with us. Thank you so much. And,
Igor, thank you very much for having me. C Vision International. It's been a pleasure.